We are in the middle of a pandemic, and no, I'm not talking about SARS coronavirus 2, but the one that has been with us for 4 decades and has killed more than 30 million people around the world. Exactly, I'm talking about HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus pandemic. This name may not tell you at all much, but I'm sure you all know the disease it causes. AIDS. Fortunately, what used to be a death sentence is now a disease that can be managed. Although there is no vaccine for HIV, there are drugs that suppress the virus to an almost undetectable degree. Today, more than half of AIDS patients are using these treatments, which have zero cost to the patient in many countries. All of this is due to a number of policies that we are going to tell you about later. But make no mistake, this pandemic is not over yet. In 2019 alone, more than 690,000 people died of AIDS. Just to give you an idea, countries in South Africa currently have 1 in 5 adults infected with HIV. However, this year, 2020, as the whole world trembles with SARS coronavirus 2, there is very good news about the older pandemic. Listen up.
Second patient cured of HIV, say doctors.
Exactly. At least we can say that not only can you live with AIDS, but you can even completely eradicate it from your body. And so today, which is World AIDS Day, we are going to tell you about the other side of this disease, the political side. That is, why politics also play a role in the fight against HIV. How is this other pandemic being fought? Why, despite having infected so many people, have we never heard of quarantine or containment measures to prevent the spread? Today we're going to answer these questions, but first, we have a moral obligation to give you some very important information about AIDS. Information that will help you understand this video, but also for your daily life. So, pay attention. The first thing we need to know about AIDS is that it stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. In other words, AIDS doesn't really kill by itself. AIDS attacks your immune system, so you can die from simple pneumonia because your body has no defenses. As with coronavirus, there are people that have the HIV virus and are asymptomatic. There are even people with the virus who never develop symptoms of AIDS. And how is HIV transmitted? We are talking about an infection that is commonly known as a sexually transmitted disease, because having unprotected sex is the main method of transmission, in addition to the exchange of other human fluids, such as blood. This means that we can live with someone who has it, shake hands with them, or even hug them, but we cannot accept blood transfusions from this person, or have unprotected sex. That's why it's so important to remember to use a condom in all your relationships. And if one day you want to stop using them with your partner, take a test first. This is not something people talk about, but in almost every country, there are centres where they do free tests. If you don't want to go to a centre, you can also buy a test at the pharmacy. The price depends on the country, but they are usually around $30. They are fast and easy to use. What if you test positive? Don't panic. HIV tests do not give false negatives, but they can give false positives. That is, if you test negative for HIV, you can relax. However, if you test positive, you should go to the doctor and have another test done to verify whether or not you have HIV. Having said that, we are now going to look back at a little bit of history.
The Invisible Killer.
In 1981, the American Center for Disease Control identified the first cases of HIV. However, the virus had been present for decades in the United States and around the world. Our story dates back to the early 20th century in what was known then as German Cameroon. HIV is a mutation of another virus found in certain types of monkeys, called SIV, or simian immunodeficiency virus. And you'll say, if it really started so long ago, how is it possible that no cases were detected until almost 80 years later? Well, the truth is that HIV is not a virus that is transmitted through the respiratory tract, like the coronavirus. In other words, at first, the transmission was much slower. The first outbreaks began in 1920 in what was then the Belgian Congo, and it is believed that in the 1960s, the first cases arrived in the United States. The first carriers were the Haitians, who returned to the American continent. By 1978, it is estimated that 5% of the population of San Francisco and New York was already HIV positive. However, at that time, no one knew that a virus as such existed. Doctors did not understand what they were really dealing with. In fact, it was not until 1981 that the US Center for Disease Control identified this new virus. At first, it was called the 4H disease because it affected mostly Haitians, homosexuals, hemophiliacs, and heroin addicts. However, since 1982, we have been calling it by the name of the disease it causes, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. Back in the 80s, being diagnosed with AIDS was a death sentence for all intents and purposes. The sick had a maximum life expectancy of 1 year after being diagnosed. The treatments were very primitive, or, to put bluntly, non-existent. Meanwhile, the virus kept on spreading. To give you an idea, in February 1983, the United States registered the first 1,000 reported cases. By the end of that same year, there were more than 3,000. 10 years later, the cases were close to 1 million. And just to give you an idea, in 1995 alone, almost 100,000 people died from this disease in the United States. This was the time when AIDS was all in the media. In fact, it was in 1993 when the film Philadelphia with Tom Hanks and Antonio Banderas was released, which served to raise awareness of this pandemic in the entire West. However, all these numbers pale in comparison to those in Africa. If you think that we are living in a dystopia in 2020 with the coronavirus, the havoc that AIDS has caused in Africa is straight out of a horror movie. In this region, AIDS is responsible for a 10-year drop in life expectancy. In 1995, average life expectancy in a country like South Africa was 63 years. By 2005, the figure had dropped to 53 years. And other countries like Botswana reached infection rates of 25%. Think about what this means. In 2000, when the pandemic reached its peak in Botswana, 1 in 4 people had HIV. By this time, more than 60% of the deaths in this country were directly related to AIDS. And the numbers reflect similar stories in every country in the region. Remember that, being very poor countries, they could hardly afford the treatments that were already available in the United States. So it was virtually impossible to survive HIV. But enough about numbers. The question you may be pondering now is, how have different governments acted to stop this pandemic? What policies are being implemented? Well, right now, we're going to go take a look.
Deadly policies.
I know what many of you are wondering by now. Why have we never heard of any confinement measures to flatten the AIDS curve? With the figures that we have just given you, it seems more than reasonable that drastic political measures be taken, at least equal to those being taken with the coronavirus, right? Well, yes, and at the same time, no. There is a very important difference between coronavirus and HIV, and it lies in the manner of transmission. Coronavirus is transmitted through the respiratory tract. This means that you only have to be near an infected person to be infected. In the case of HIV, it is only transmitted by sexual or fluid contact, mainly blood. In other words, in theory, it is possible to reduce infections without having to confine an entire country. This does not mean, however, that governments do not have a responsibility to try and stop the pandemic. Keep in mind that there is no vaccine for AIDS, so public policy is crucial to prevent contagion. And believe me, if SARS coronavirus 2 has highlighted how negligent many governments can be, HIV showed us the same thing even before 2020. And if there is one country where the government has failed absolutely, it is South Africa. We are talking about the richest country in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, they don't have the living standards of the United States or any European country, but in the 1990s, South Africa had good hospitals. To put it in perspective, this is the country where the first ever heart transplant was performed. In other words, it was a country that had the resources to control the pandemic. The problem was the government.
Does HIV cause AIDS? Can a virus cause a syndrome? How? It can't, because a syndrome is a group of diseases resulting from acquired immune deficiency. Thabo Mbeki, president of South Africa from 1999 to 2008.
That's right. While South Africa was battling the worst phases of the pandemic, its president denied that there was a connection between the virus and the disease. The health ministry recommended things like garlic or beets to fight AIDS. By that time, the first antiretroviral drugs to treat AIDS had been released. This explains why death rates were already falling in the United States and Europe. However, in South Africa, many hospitals refused to supply them. And I know what many of you were thinking. Were they refusing to administer them, or did they simply not have the money to pay for them? As you can imagine, these early antiretroviral drugs were expensive. In 1999, treatment cost about $800 per patient a month. And yes, you were right, money was an important factor. But surprisingly, the main reason why these drugs were not provided was that the authorities did not want them to be given. We had to wait until 2002 for the South African Constitutional Court to take action.
South African government forced to give mothers antiretroviral drug. The fight has raged for close to a year in different courts, with the government losing at every stage, but fighting on. The government has contested that the drug's safety has not been proven, although it provided no evidence to back up its claim and maintained that the courts should have no role in the creation of health policy.
That's right. The South African government did not want to give drugs to prevent mothers with AIDS from passing it on to their children. So what about preventative measures? As we have already said, a key measure to prevent HIV infection is condoms. Remember, we are talking about a disease that is mainly transmitted sexually. It makes sense, doesn't it? Well, far from promoting the use of condoms, many South African institutions did exactly the opposite. Take a look.
South African Catholic Church condemns condom use to prevent HIV spread.
And we are not only talking about the church. Do you remember the 2010 World Cup? The one where Spain won and made the vuvuzela trendy? Well, pay attention.
World Cup 2010. FIFA blocking condom distribution at venues, say AIDS groups.
Conclusion? In 2010, 45% of all deaths in South Africa were AIDS related. In fact, even today, AIDS is a major problem in this country. However, just as there are many cases like South Africa, there are also countries that have been able to implement effective AIDS policies. That is the case in the United Kingdom.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure.
From the early years of the pandemic, the United Kingdom realised that HIV is transmitted primarily through two routes: unprotected sex and sharing needles. Remember that heroin use was rampant in the 1980s and the 1990s. Millions of people were hooked on this drug, which is one of the most dangerous in existence. And as you know, heroin is mainly consumed intravenously. Many heroin addicts shared needles to shoot up. So the UK was one of the first countries to come out with programs to offer new syringes to addicts. In addition, they pioneered sex education campaigns. The government funded all kinds of advertising campaigns to get the British to use condoms. Thanks to this effort, in 2010, only 0.5% of deaths in this country were related to AIDS, compared to 45% in South Africa. As you can see, fighting a pandemic is not only a matter of medical technology, but also of good policy. However, don't despair. At the beginning of this video, we told you that there is good news about AIDS. My dear friends of VisualPolitik, now comes the feel-good part of the video. Stay tuned.
A light at the end of the pandemic?
One of the countries most affected by AIDS is Botswana. At the peak of this pandemic, nearly 60% of the country's deaths were AIDS related. However, the numbers have now dropped to 28%. And the best news is that Botswana is not an isolated case. In 2000, there were 3 million new infections each year worldwide. That number is now below 2 million. And this decline is led by the region most affected, sub-Saharan Africa. New infections dropped by 30% from 2010 to 2018. And what is the reason for this improvement? Well, to a large extent, we have to thank international organizations such as the United Nations. We can criticize the UN for many things, but we also have to recognize when they get it right. And in the fight against AIDS, they have played a key role, along with another organization called the Global Fund and the United States. Specifically, it was George Bush Jr. who founded the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Bush commissioned Anthony Fauci to design a plan that would really turn the situation around, no matter what it took. And yes, we're talking about the very same Fauci who now advises the White House in the fight against the coronavirus. Since the creation of this AIDS plan, known by its acronym PEPFAR, Washington has spent more than 90 billion USD on all kinds of campaigns. It is estimated that this plan alone has saved more than 13 million lives, and this explains why, according to several surveys, George Bush is the most popular US president in sub-Saharan Africa, surpassing others like Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. Since then, very effective and, above all, very pragmatic professional campaigns have been launched. That is, without ideology, without religion, and with measurable objectives. For example, we talked to a consultant who worked on one of these campaigns. Specifically, her job was to get all sex workers in Angola to use condoms. As I said, religion and ideology was left for another day. For this purpose, purpose, she designed a network of centers in all villages of the country where they gave free condoms to the prostitutes. They made it possible to go to any of these places and pick up a box. However, the plan did not work. Most of the sex workers did not want to use condoms. So what did this consultant do? Well, a market study. After several interviews, she discovered that sex workers did not use condoms because they smelled bad. Solution? They started handing out flavored condoms. They even did a study to see which flavors were the most popular. A few months later, more than 86% of the sex workers were using protection. With policies like this, Angola has been bending the curve of HIV infection since 2011. And this is just one example of the many programs that have come out. From drug delivery programs to sex education. All of them with clear and measurable objectives and a follow-up program. In part, thanks to these programs, by the year 2018, 53% of AIDS patients worldwide were able to live with the disease and not transmit it. And although the timeline has had to be pushed back a little, it is now estimated that by 2030, the magic figure of 90-90-90 could be reached. That is, 90% of those infected will be aware that they are carriers. 90% of these infected will have treatments, and 90% of this last group can live with the virus without infecting others. That's not the end of the story, because as AIDS policies have improved over time, so have treatments. In fact, it is in this aspect of the story that the United States has played a very important role. The US government has not only coordinated many plans like the ones we've outlined, in addition, the United States pays for almost half of the treatment in Africa. Today, antiretroviral treatment can cost about $9 a month, and in many countries like Angola, it is even available at zero cost. And this is due to funding from the United States and other countries. And finally, we have the pharmaceutical factor. Treatment research has reached such a point that we can finally see news headlines like this.
Second patient cured of HIV, say doctors. BBC, March 2020.
This news story is from the year 2020. For the first time in history, 2 AIDS patients have been cured of the disease. Of course, this news has many aspects. These 2 cases have been very specific and were treated in very special circumstances. If you want more details, you can follow the links in the description. But the important thing about this news is that we can now say that AIDS is no longer an incurable disease. However, it's not all good news. Whilst almost all countries are reducing their infection rates, and above all, their mortality rates, there is one country that is breaking the trend: Russia. Check out this graph. Interestingly, Russia initially seemed to be a country immune to the pandemic. However, since the mid-2000s, the numbers have skyrocketed. By 2017, 1.3% of adults aged 15 to 49 were infected, and mortality rates have skyrocketed too. So, what is the cause for all this? The answer is, once again, in politics. To date, the policies that have worked best are those of the United Kingdom. That is, education campaigns, clean syringe distribution, and condom distribution. And it is just the opposite of what they're currently doing in Russia. To give you an idea, since 2014, Russia has laws that condemn so-called gay propaganda. This gay propaganda would include all campaigns to promote safe homosexual sex. The same goes for any kind of sex education, which is interpreted as the pernicious influence of the West. And let's not talk about the distribution of syringes, which is understood to be a way of promoting drug addiction. So what seemed to be a region immune to the virus is beginning to have serious problems. But now, the question is over to you. Do you think we will end up finding a universal cure for AIDS soon? Will a vaccine appear? What lessons can we take from the management of HIV that would be useful to us in the coronavirus pandemic? You can leave your answer down in the comments. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did. And don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, we'll see you in the next video.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.